The Dakota wind cut like a cavalry saber across the prairie, a physical force that scoured the land and stole the breath. The snow didn't fall so much as it attacked, driven horizontally in a blinding white chaos. It was January 11th, 1873, just past 3 in the afternoon, and the world had ended. The temperature had plummeted 40 degrees in less than an hour, a meteorological event so violent it felt like a personal judgment. For any man or beast caught in the open, life expectancy was now measured in minutes. But inside the gentle slope of Miller's Hill, 15 feet deep into the earth itself, Silas Garrett felt only a whisper of the storm's fury. The wind's scream was a muffled hum, a distant beast clawing at a door it could not open. A small fire crackled contentedly in his cast-iron stove, its warmth radiating through the single, large room. The air was a comfortable 55 degrees. His wife, Ada, sat calmly knitting by the light of a kerosene lamp, the rhythmic click of her needles a quiet counterpoint to the muffled apocalypse outside. In the attached stable, separated by a thick wooden wall, their chestnut mare, Copper, crunched on oats, safe and warm. Silas looked at the barometric pressure gauge he'd mounted on a timber support beam. The needle was pressed as far down as it could go. He had been right, and he had never wished so desperately to be wrong. 6 months earlier, in the sweltering heat of July 1872, Silas Garrett stood before Mayor Hutchkins in the dusty town of Prosperity. The mayor, a man whose ambition outsized his small domain, looked at the deed in his hand with unconcealed disdain. "You paid $50 for 10 acres of the north face of Miller's Hill? Son, that land's not worth the ink on this paper. It's too steep to plow, too rocky for grazing, nothing but a lump of dirt." Silas, a man of 35, with the quiet eyes of someone who has spent years observing the world rather than commanding it, simply nodded. "That lump of dirt is precisely what I want, Mayor." Hutchkins leaned back, his chair groaning in protest. "And what, pray tell, do you plan to do with it? You can't build a proper house on a 40-degree slope." "I don't intend to build on it," Silas replied calmly. "I intend to build in it." The mayor's condescending smile froze. "In it? Like a badger? Like a man who understands thermal mass," Silas said, the technical term landing with a thud in the small office. "I spent 8 years as a surveyor for the Union Pacific mayor. A good portion of that time was spent blasting tunnels through hillsides just like that one. I learned a few things. The earth at a depth of 10 or 15 feet holds a near constant temperature year-round. Around 50 degrees here, I'd wager. It's cooler than a frame house in summer and warmer in winter. It requires a fraction of the fuel to heat, and no wind on this earth can knock it down." Mayor Hutchkins exchanged a look with Marcus Webb, the wealthiest rancher in the county, who had been observing the transaction with amusement. Webb, a man who had just completed a 2-story ranch house with glass windows shipped from St. Louis, let out a short, barking laugh. "So you mean to live in a hole in the ground? We're trying to build a civilized town here, Garrett, a town called Prosperity. We have a schoolhouse, a church. We build with milled lumber and square nails. We're not primitives." Silas met his gaze without rancor. "The Mandan people built earth lodges for 1,000 years not far from here. They survived winters that would kill us in our drafty wooden boxes. I don't see that as primitive. I see it as wise." The mayor waved a dismissive hand. "Well, it's your $50. Just don't expect the town council to approve any unusual structures." He said the word unusual as if it were a communicable disease. "The structure will be sound," Silas assured him, "and it will be my own business." Word of Silas Garrett's plan spread through Prosperity's 400 souls faster than a prairie fire. It became the town's favorite topic of conversation, a source of endless humor and speculation. By the end of the week, his project had a name: Garrett's Burrow. Some called it the Badger's Hole. The more poetic called it Garrett's Folly. The mockery was relentless and came from all corners. Thomas Brennan, the owner of the general store and the town's most practical-minded man, shook his head as he sold Silas a dozen shovel heads and 2 heavy-duty wheelbarrows. "Silas, I've built every house in this town. You build up on a stone foundation with a proper frame. You don't dig down. The ground freezes. It shifts. You'll be buried alive in your own home." Father O'Brien, the town priest, saw it as a spiritual failing. A man should look to the heavens, not burrow into the dirt like a creature without a soul. It's an act of hiding from God's light. "I'm not hiding, Father. I'm preparing," was Silas's quiet reply. "There's a difference. Even Margaret Foster, the school teacher, used him as a cautionary tale for her students. She spoke of the march of progress, of how mankind had emerged from caves into the light of reason and civilization. Mr. Garrett, she explained, was choosing to walk backward. The children giggled and whispered about the strange man who wanted to live like a gopher. Marcus Webb was the most vocal critic. He would often ride his fine horse out to the base of Miller's Hill to watch Silas work, shouting unsolicited advice from his saddle. "I've got a barn that cost me $3,000 to build, Garrett, properly framed with a hayloft that can hold 20 tons. You think you're going to do better with dirt and shovels? You're wasting your summer," Silas never argued. He simply wiped the sweat from his brow, nodded politely, and continued his methodical labor. He and Ada worked from sunup to sundown. Their horse, Copper, was hitched to a slip scraper, and together they moved tons of earth. Silas, using the skills he'd learned in the mountains, first marked out the dimensions, an excavation 20 feet wide and 30 feet long, driven straight into the south-facing slope. The south face was critical. It would catch the low winter sun and be sheltered from the prevailing northwesterly winds. The work was brutally hard. He dug 15 feet deep into the hillside, a process that took 3 weeks of relentless effort. He wasn't just digging a hole, he was engineering a space. He knew the soil composition, a heavy clay mixed with glacial till, stable and dense. When the main excavation was complete, he used timber he'd cut and hauled himself to shore up the entrance and the ceiling, placing massive 10-inch diameter logs every 4 feet. He wasn't taking any chances. Thomas Brennan's warning about collapse, while based on ignorance of the technique, was a valid concern if not done properly. For the front of the dugout, the only part exposed to the elements, he and Ada built a wall 2 feet thick, not with wood, but with sod bricks. Ada, who had grown up on a Nebraska farm where soddies were common, was the expert here. They cut dense bricks of prairie sod, thick with the root systems of buffalo grass, and laid them like stones. The roots held the earth together, and the sheer thickness of the wall provided insulation that no 1-inch plank of wood could ever match. They left openings for a single sturdy door and 2 small, deep-set windows. The townspeople watched the construction with the morbid curiosity of a crowd at a hanging. Betting pools were started at the saloon, one on when he'd give up, another on whether the roof would collapse before the first snow. When Silas was seen digging a smaller, connected chamber off the main room for copper, the laughter redoubled. Now he's building a burrow for his horse. He thinks he's Noah, building an ark in the dirt. Silas and Ada were socially isolated. Invitations to barn raisings and church socials stopped coming. The women of the town, led by the mayor's wife, treated Ada with a mixture of pity and scorn. To choose to live in such a primitive state, they whispered behind their hands at the general store. It just wasn't respectable. Ada bore it with the same quiet dignity as her husband. "Let them talk," she told Silas one evening, as they ate their dinner by lantern light inside the nearly completed structure. "Their mockery is based on assumption. Our confidence is based on knowledge." Silas drove a final nail into the frame of the interior stable wall. "Time will tell," he said. It was his standard reply to every jibe and every warning. By late October, the dugout was complete. From a distance, it was nearly invisible, a mere interruption in the grassy slope of the hill. They moved in their few possessions, a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and the magnificent new stove that had cost them $22. The interior was simple but comfortable. The walls were smooth packed clay, and the timbered ceiling felt as solid as a mountain. The air was cool and smelled of earth and curing wood. They soon discovered the benefits he had predicted. On hot autumn days, the dugout remained cool. As the first frosts arrived, the ambient temperature inside never dropped below 50 degrees. A small morning fire in the stove was enough to keep the space comfortably warm all day. They were using a fraction of the firewood their neighbors in town were already burning through. The town's prediction was unanimous. Give it 1 winter. They'll come crawling back to civilization before January. But Silas and Ada thrived. Their life was one of quiet efficiency. The dugout was easy to maintain, always comfortable and preternaturally quiet. It was a sanctuary from the incessant Dakota wind that wore down the nerves of everyone else in prosperity. In the second week of January, Silas began to feel a change. It wasn't something a man like Marcus Webb or Mayor Hutchkins would ever notice. It was in the air, in the light. Silas, from his years on the plains, had learned to read the subtle language of the sky. The barometric pressure, which he checked 3 times a day, began a slow, steady fall. The birds disappeared. The usual chorus of coyotes at night fell silent. The air grew heavy, static, and the sky took on a strange, sickly yellow-gray tint, like an old bruise. On the morning of January 11th, he went into town for supplies. The air was unnaturally still and warm for January. People were in their shirt sleeves, remarking on the pleasant weather. Silas saw it for what it was, the calm before the assault. He found Thomas Brennan outside his store. "Thomas, you should tell people to bring their livestock in close. Bank the fires and check your wood piles. There's a storm coming. A bad one." Brennan laughed, though it was less mocking than it had been months ago. He had developed a grudging respect for Silas's work ethic, if not his ideas. "A storm, Silas? It's the finest day we've had all winter." "The sky doesn't lie," Silas said, gesturing with his chin. "And neither does the glass. It's falling faster now." He turned to go. "I'd bring your family out to my place if I were you. We have room." Brennan just shook his head, a sad smile on his face. "Thanks for the offer, Silas, but we'll be just fine in our house. A proper house." Silas didn't argue. He bought what he needed: extra kerosene, salt, flour, and headed home. He spent the rest of the morning securing the dugout. He double-checked the sod wall, banked extra earth against the base, and ensured the stovepipe chimney, which vented straight up through 10 feet of earth, was clear. He brought in enough firewood to last 2 weeks and filled every spare bucket with water from his well. He gave Copper an extra ration of feed and fresh bedding. By 2 in the afternoon, he and Ada were sealed inside. They had done all they could. At 3 p.m., the world broke. A low moan from the northwest grew into a deafening roar. The sky went from yellow-gray to a terrifying black-green, then to pure white. The first wave of wind hit not like a gale, but like a solid object, a locomotive made of ice and fury. The temperature plunged. It was 32 degrees at 3 p.m. By 3:20 p.m., it was 10 below zero. The snow, fine and granular as sand, blasted horizontally, erasing the world in seconds. Visibility dropped to the length of a man's arm, then to nothing at all. Inside Garrett's burrow, the first gusts of wind were barely audible. The structure didn't creak or groan like a wooden house. It was part of the hill, and the hill did not move. Silas watched the temperature on his wall thermometer. It dipped from 55 to 50. He added 2 small logs to the stove. The temperature climbed back to 58 and held steady. For 5 days, the blizzard raged without pause. The wind howled at a sustained 60 miles per hour, with gusts that sounded like artillery fire. The temperature bottomed out at 40 degrees below zero, a cold so profound it was a living entity, a predator seeking to leech the life from anything warm. In the town of Prosperity, it was a waking nightmare. The wind found every crack in the wooden houses, driving snow and icy air inside. Families huddled around their stoves, feeding them constantly, but the cold was winning. The walls were coated in a thick layer of frost. Water froze solid in buckets just feet from the fire. Marcus Webb's grand 2-story house, with its expensive glass windows, became a death trap. The wind shattered 2 windows on the north side, and no amount of blankets could plug the breach. His family was forced to retreat into a single downstairs room, burning their fine furniture to stay alive. Roofs began to groan under the impossible weight of the snow. Chimneys became blocked, filling houses with smoke. Doors were buried under drifts that reached the eaves, trapping people inside. The town's woodpiles, meant to last a month, were being consumed at a terrifying rate. By the 3rd day, the first death occurred. An elderly man, living alone, ran out of wood. They found him frozen in his bed after the storm. On the evening of the 3rd day, as the storm reached its zenith, Silas and Ada heard a frantic pounding on their sturdy wooden door. Silas took a lantern and unbarred it. 2 figures, so encrusted with snow and ice they were barely recognizable as human, fell into the dugout. It was Thomas Brennan and his young son. Brennan was shaking uncontrollably, his face a mask of frozen terror. "My God, Silas," he stammered, his words slurring from the cold. "You were right. You were right." His house was still standing, but they had run out of firewood that morning. They had burned their chairs, their table. Facing a certain death, he had wrapped his son in every blanket they owned and made a desperate, blind run for Miller's Hill, navigating by memory and sheer will. It had taken them 2 hours to travel half a mile. Ada stripped off their frozen clothes and wrapped them in warm blankets, forcing hot broth between their lips. There was no recrimination, no, "I told you so." There was only quiet, immediate compassion. They were the first. Over the next 12 hours, more came. One by one, family by family, they stumbled through the maelstrom to the one place in Prosperity that was not fighting the storm, but ignoring it. They came seeking the shelter they had mocked for 6 months. The dugout became a crowded, humming ark. Silas's preparations held. There was enough food, enough water, and the single stove kept the 27 souls huddled inside from the lethal cold. The air remained a steady, life-sustaining 50 degrees. The last to arrive was Mayor Hutchkins. He was alone, half dead, and weeping. His house, one of the finest in town, had collapsed under the snow load. He had barely escaped with his life. Silas pulled him in and sat him by the stove, and the mayor, who had laughed at the idea of living like a badger, now huddled for warmth in the very burrow he had ridiculed. When the storm finally broke on the 5th day, the sun rose on a world transformed and shattered. The landscape was a uniform, undulating sea of white. Prosperity was gone, buried. Only the tops of a few roofs were visible. Silas and the other able-bodied men dug their way out of the dugout's entrance. The devastation was absolute. 12 people were dead. Every family had lost most, if not all, of their livestock. Half the buildings in town were either collapsed or severely damaged. Marcus Webb's $3,000 barn was a flattened wreck, his prize cattle frozen where they stood. His grand house was unlivable. The town of Prosperity had been wiped from the map in 5 days. A week later, what was left of the town council met in the dugout, the only intact structure large enough to hold them. Mayor Hutchkins, his face gaunt and aged by a decade, stood before Silas. His voice was quiet, stripped of all its former bluster. "Silas," he began, his eyes meeting his, "I owe you an apology. On behalf of this whole town, I owe you our lives and an apology. I called you a fool. I laughed at you. I called your work Garrett's folly." He gestured around the warm, life-filled room. "This folly saved 27 lives. I was wrong, dead wrong. You didn't build a primitive hole. You built the only wise thing in this entire county." Silas simply nodded. "That doesn't matter now, Mayor. You're safe. That's what matters. We never wanted to be proven right this way." That spring, there was no talk of leaving. The survivors were bound by the shared trauma and the shared salvation. The town's name was quietly changed from Prosperity to Endurance. And the first order of business was reconstruction. Thomas Brennan, the town's builder, came to Silas, hat in hand. "Will you teach me?" he asked. "Not just me, all of us. We need to learn." Silas spent that summer not building for himself, but teaching. He showed them how to read the land, how to choose a proper site, how to excavate, how to brace with timber, and how to build with the very earth that had nearly killed them. By the following winter, 11 new dugouts dotted the hillsides around the town of Endurance. They were warmer, safer, and built for a fraction of the cost of the wooden homes they replaced. The knowledge spread. Garrett's method became the standard for prairie construction across the territory. Silas Garrett lived to be 71, a respected elder in the community he had inadvertently saved. When he died peacefully in his sleep, his funeral was attended by the children and grandchildren of the people who had once mocked him. He was buried, at his request, on the top of Miller's Hill, overlooking the home he had built. Decades later, the original dugout was preserved by the town as a historic site. The town of Endurance, true to its name, had survived and grown, a community built on a foundation of humility and hard-won wisdom. At the entrance to the old dugout, a bronze plaque was installed. It read, "Silas Garrett, 1837 to 1908. When civilization mocked, wisdom built." When the storm came, the rock endured. He worked with the earth, not against it, and in so doing saved a town. His horse, Copper, was the first to trust the shelter, and the first life it saved. The dugout still stands, a quiet testament carved into the heart of the prairie. It is a reminder that mockery often masks a fear of the unfamiliar, and that sometimes the most forward-thinking solutions are the ones that are ancient and deep. The wind still scours the Dakota plains, as fierce and unforgiving as ever. But in endurance, the people listen to the earth, and they are not afraid. The wise don't fight nature. They find shelter within it.